future to look. Frank, please join us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yep. I'm good to go mic-wise, so thank you. And I think Josh set me up very wonderfully because I knew a little bit about what he was going to talk about, but I had no idea he was going to go so deep with complexity. And I'm a big complexity geek, and I guess my slides are ready. So today I'm going to talk to you about what I call Holoptic Foresight Dynamics, and it really is a play exactly on what Josh was just talking about. As a matter of fact, I love what he said, so I'm going to say that he covered a lot of what I could have covered. Thank you for that, Josh. And I'm going to tell you how to actually do this and how to think this way, because the premise of what I really want to talk about today is I believe that we're in this complex environment that is saying to us that we need to purposefully and intentionally evolve humanity, that we need to take ourselves intentionally into this new kind of thinking. So it's one thing for us to say, oh, we'll fall back on human nature as it was, but we need to understand how evolution allows us to do this as a direction on that sense, and can we actually apply this kind of thinking on a social level in a larger way? Can it actually be intentionally done? So, of course, this is the slide where you get to see my face and Yvette and I. As a matter of fact, I wanted to put this in there because I wanted to share with you a little bit at the end that we can actually help you to do this, not just my company, but this way of thinking and some of the stuff that we've done over the last several years. And so you'll get to see this at the end again as well. So she said, we're really doing strategic foresight. How many of you in the room are familiar with strategic foresight, the field of foresight, the field of futures? Not many, so I've got a lot of virgins in here. That's great. So actually, foresight is a field that's been around for 100 years. It's much more practiced in Asia and in Europe and places like that. There's you can get your master's degree in foresight. I have mine. Makes my mom super proud. You can get your PhD in foresight now. A lot of people call it by different names: futurism, futures thinking, future studies, and a lot of organizations today are building futures teams and foresight divisions in their companies. They realize that they need to think this way because they see that we're not living just in this complicated world, but we're living in a much more complex world. And so our firm Kedge and the Future School, which is the teaching arm, really helps people to understand how to live in this way with strategy and innovation and organizational development, personal development as well. And that's what I really want to talk to you about today is not just how foresight is used at an organizational level, but how I believe and foresight is increasingly moving in this direction away from reductive thinking and the reductive thinking you see in design thinking and foresight today into a much more circular and complex way of thinking that allows us to think this way, not just individually, but collectively as well. So you can't really see the slide as well. It's sort of a dark scene anyway, but you might be able to see Amy Adams' face up there. And this is actually a scene from the movie Arrival. How many of you saw the movie Arrival? So I got a few, and I knew there was a sci-fi panel in here later today too, so I think you'll appreciate this. This is actually a scene near the end of the movie, and if you saw Arrival, if you didn't see Arrival, I'm sorry, I'm gonna ruin it for you right now. So. Spoiler alert. But I won't give the whole thing away, but unfortunately, this is the big piece. They're actually learning. It's an alien movie, but it's not really an alien movie. Because in the movie, aliens come, but they come with a gift or a weapon, and the gift is their language. When you speak in the alien language, you actually are able to see the past, the present, and the future as one timeline, circular rather than linear. And that's a very interesting scene here at the end that the Chinese are about to attack the aliens because they can't figure out why they're there. And Amy Adams actually figures out because she's starting to think in their language, having communicated with, they've been learning their language, she's starting to think about the future as the present, the past as the present, and the future, et cetera, in a circle. And so she actually sees Dr. Chang, or General Chang, who is the head of the Chinese military in the movie, say to her, "I'm so glad that you called me 18 months ago to stop the attack." She says, "I don't even know your cell phone number." He shows her the number. In the present day, she goes and calls him and stops the attack. So it's really interesting from the perspective, not that I believe that there is a field or a way for us to become precognizant in this way or that we're all going to gain ESP, but rather that we can purposely and intentionally think about the future in a manner that changes our ethical actions in the present. When we intentionally and purposely think about the future, it's not so that we can say 10 years from now, did we get it right? It's so that we can use quantitative and qualitative data in the present to make sure that our actions are future fit and future empowered and future focused. Are we doing things today that will allow us to be ethical, to allow us to be purposeful and intentional about where we're going in the future and make those right decisions. Think about climate change, for instance. We've been thinking about it for a long time. And we've been thinking about it, we've been thinking about it, we've been thinking about it. But we haven't really acted on it. And this kind of futures thinking causes us to be intentional, robust, and purposeful in the present so that we make those right decisions. So I do believe, in a sense, and this is why I put this slide up there, that this movie holds a lot of value for us in the sense that we can move into what I call Holoptic Foresight Dynamics. It's a way of thinking about foresight that is less linear and much more circular, and I'll tell you what it means. So for Phi Draft Kappa, it talks a lot about complexity that we just heard Josh talk about a few minutes ago, but a couple of things that I thought were really important for the talk here today was what he said about complexity being a network of inseparable patterns of relationships. That evolution is no longer seen as a competitive struggle for existence. We know evolution and Darwinian evolution all about the struggle of competition. But as we're studying evolutionary sciences today and evolutionary biology, we're starting to see that it wasn't about competition, it's about collaboration. And that we may have gotten evolution from a Darwinian perspective quite wrong. Evolution itself right, the perspective of evolution may be quite wrong. A lot of evolutionists are saying this today. So it's rather a cooperative dance in which creativity and constant emergence of novelty are the driving forces. And with the new emphasis on complexity, as Josh said, networks and patterns of organization, a new science of qualities is emerging. And I thought this was important as well because you'll hear later Nora Bateson on her video talk about a new science of qualities as well. So this is, I got to share at the International Design Conference this past week in Chicago. I had this slide up for them, and I thought that I would just leave it in there because I thought it was pertinent for what I was talking about today. The design thinking needs to actually think bigger. The way we design the world, our purposeful, intentional way that we're designing things needs to think bigger. And of course, you're applying this a lot today to AI and machine learning and data science and those kinds of things, but I'm talking about the merging of the quant and the qual. And that's what complexity requires us to do. We have to think in a new way. Complexity is not the enemy. Our outdated way of thinking is the enemy. Complexity is a natural evolution towards maturity. When things become more complex, they mature. When I have a baby, this is an oversimplified example. I love to study complexity, but I'll just give you an oversimplified example. I have a newborn baby. Beautiful, right? Yes. Did you look at the right end? It must not be as lovely as you. And when it becomes a teenager, which one is more complex, the baby or the teenager? Obviously, a simplified example. When I look out into the universe, I don't see greater simplicity, I see greater complexity. We have been bombarded in our minds to think the simplicity is the answer, complexity is the enemy. That's completely false. It's completely false in terms of evolutionary science, completely false in complexity science as well. The more complex an organism is, the more capable it comes, the more capable it is, the more we can address challenges and seize opportunities. So we'd love to think about complexity as the enemy in terms of the quant, but when things evolve, they evolve from quant to qual. That's not negating quantitative science. It's saying that it's all a part of the process, and we need a bigger understanding of this process. We live in a massively complex system, and we have to think this way as humans. So really, to really help you understand what I mean by holoptic foresight dynamics, it's important to understand what I had already touched on a few minutes ago, that evolutionary science is more and more tending towards less competition and more of collaboration and cooperation. And that's how things actually have evolved, as it turns out. So the trajectory of evolution is actually one towards higher levels of systemic complexity. Let me say that again. The trajectory of evolution is one towards higher levels of systemic complexity. So every time that you try to defeat complexity and punch it in the face, you're punching the evolutionary process in the face. Because we have been bombarded to think in these ways that drive us towards greater simplicity when we need to be thinking about greater complexity. So I sort of put a slide in there so that I could just sort of get back on track again with myself and say, also, that all of this technology that we're building, which is very complicated and is very complex, is a part of this co-evolutionary process that we're experiencing. We've always, by the way, co-evolved with technology. Fire is technology, roads are technology, not just my cell phone is technology. So man has always co-evolved with technology. Technology is a helpmate. Anything that we've created as a helpmate to evolve or to build a greater dynamic is technology. So our technology today is speeding up. It's not just the Moore's Law principle. It's speeding up our own intentional and purposeful evolution. Because for a long time, we've been starting to take our evolution to our own hands. We're evolving ourselves as a species. And technology is a big player in that. It always has been. It's not the only one. There's social, there's economic, environmental, policies and government and on, but evolution plays a big role in this. Technology plays a big role in our evolution. And so some of these elements such as neuroscience and microsciences and posthumanism and off this planet to others and robotics and hyperweb, et cetera, have all played a role in that co-evolutionary dance that we're playing with complexity. And so we call this intentional evolution. And this is the environment of accelerating complexity that's driving active and participatory forms of human development, instead of simply allowing things to unfold in a sort of more biological kind of way. That doesn't mean the biology part's eliminated. Actually, as we learn this holoptic dance, we're learning to dance more with these, not just synthetic, but organic ways of thinking, rather than just these technical or mechanical ways of thinking. As a matter of fact, if you've studied the science of efficiency in organizations, around that same time, there were two big voices. And one of them was saying, hey, look, we need to make things more efficient like a machine, and that's how humans will work. And the other big voice at that time was saying, nope, that's not going to work. That's going to eventually break down. Unless we look at humans as being complex and organic and design our systems organically, we're going to have a breakdown. And guess which way we chose? We chose the mechanical, efficient way, because that's the way this, we saw machines and organisms running organizations. But organizations and machines don't run that way because they have humans in them, the people-centric economy, right? And so when we think that way, humans are messy and we're complicated, and we're complex, and we don't work the way the machine works. And so then we're always trying to put these two things together, which don't work that way. Instead, intentional evolution allows us to think about accelerating complexity in this way. So let me just take you on a journey then on the way that we sort of have thought and the way that we ought to be thinking, and how this kind of foresight and what I really believe that eventually machine learning, data science, artificial intelligence really needs to be aiming for and need to be a part of the process and part of the story of evolving this holoptic dynamics of futures thinking or future empowered species, and stop just being a past thinking species or mechanical species. We should not be evolving that way. So when we think really monoptically, we're thinking about the mono, from person to person. There was an era where I could only speak to you and you could only speak to me. It's just like we heard a few minutes ago, the gentleman on the bike in China and the rice paddies, but now he has the cell phone, and so it's not just monoptic environments for him anymore. He's not just speaking person to person, that's all I know. But we're really familiar today, especially in the internet age, and a lot of people have talked about this panoptic environment we're in. The idea that I am the jail master, and I can stand at the center of the prison, and I can see all the prisoners, and I can watch them, and they can't see one another, but I sort of stand as the central element in the entire prison, and I can see this Foucaultian idea, of the prison, right? But that's really not enough in this environment of complexity. That only allows us to think about these complicated issues. It doesn't really allow us to evolve in complexity. We need a holoptic environment. And the word holoptic really comes from the idea of the fly's eye. So have you ever studied, entomology, as we were talking about earlier? Have you ever seen a fly's eye where it's all the little pieces and particles, almost, bits and dots? And when they look, they see all of the surrounding and they take it all in as a whole. Our eye is a little less developed in some manners of speaking, and we look straight and we see one thing. But we need a holoptic eye. How do we get that? We get that through this collective evolution. We get this through the collaboration instead of through the competition. And so in a holoptic environment, I understand my role in the emergence of the future. You understand your role in the emergence of the future. I understand your role in the emergence of the future. And together, we also all see the whole as a unique entity that is evolving, and we begin to understand what is trying to emerge. I'm not talking about prediction, although I'm flirting with some of those words because I don't believe we should try to predict the future. We should look at a more robust environment that's unfolding to understand what's emerging, but a holoptic foresight dynamics, rather than just creating scenarios, which we do for companies, or painting maps, allows us to really understand the future, not just as a time, which is limited, or as a place, which is also reductive and limited, but it allows us to understand it as an experience, an encounter. And then we work backwards through time and space, because we say if the future is trying to emerge from us collectively, and we see this holoptic dynamic of the unfolding of the whole, then we make sense of time and space. Let me clear that up for you a little bit more by just saying, first of all, what is holoptic foresight dynamics really? It is the co-creation of emerging properties that are greater than the sum of the parts involved. The co-creation, the intentional evolution of emerging properties that are greater than the sum of the parts involved. It is what we might call precognizant perception, sort of our arrival scene, or if you saw Minority Report, the precogs. But I'm not really talking about seeing the future like ESP. It's rather understanding what is trying to emerge. Where is humanity headed? What are we trying to do, instead of this disjointed idea that we have? So precognizant perception of the parts of the emerging whole as a unique entity. We see the whole as a unique entity. And awareness by the parts within the system of their individual diversity, as well as their role in creating the emerging whole and larger purpose, and then intentional evolution practiced by the parts of the whole. So is it possible for us to just not talk about this, and it sounds like a heady presentation, and we're like, whoa, this is a lot to digest? Is it possible for us to actually teach this kind of thinking? We could boil it down a little bit, and the answer is yes. So let me just say quickly that the push and pull when we're thinking about foresight, when we're thinking about futures thinking, intentional empowerment of people towards the future, really exists across the spectrum. And that spectrum on one end is the push to the future. We've already heard a lot about that today. What are the trends coming at us? What is the data? What is the information? How much of there is it? How much are we gathering? Are we paying attention to it? Are we doing a good enough job? And it's pushing us somewhere. But the other end of the future on the spectrum is the pull of the future. And that is that part where we can pull ourselves to the future more intentionally, that we're looking towards aspirational and transformational outcomes. That's where complexity lies. And so I'm not saying that you ignore any part of the stream of the future. This entire spectrum is important, but we know this so well, and we barely are familiar with this end of the spectrum of the future, and we have to purposely, intentionally become more aware of this end of the spectrum. So in other words, to really follow on what Josh was saying, we're moving from epistemic uncertainty to ontological unpredictability. And basically, in a nutshell, that means that epistemic, the knowledge, uncertainty, I'm just uncertain about what's coming next. So if I just gather enough information, I know what's wrong. We just need more data. We need more data. If I just gather more information, it'll solve the problem. In a complex world, it will not. Because in an ontological, unpredictable world, which we're in right now, the actual nature of the future itself starts to change. We're changing the nature of things. So you tell me, when I had 80 species of animals, and I was one of these early, thousands of years ago, animal husbandry people, could I see the evolution of a cow that gave milk hundreds and hundreds of years later? I'm not gonna stand back here and say, I can see the cow, because I haven't understood the nature that's changing yet. This is the way that we have to start thinking if we're going to understand the changing nature of things, rather than just like we're incrementally moving along. If I just get more data, everything will be solved. It will not. It will not. And so we have to think this way if we're going to be future empowered as a future empowered species. So there's three ways that we can do that. The first is called sensing, the second is meshing, and the third is transforming. And these are the mindsets that we actually learn that help us to be holoptic and to learn these dynamics to evolve as a species together. So the first, sensing, is all about really understanding, moving beyond the trends to understanding the patterns that are unfolding around us. By the way, all of these trends and all of this data and all this information, it does not stay in a silo. It does not stay by itself. It's colliding, it's coming together, and it's actually something that we need to make sense of. And this is really where complex adaptive systems come in. So we have to think about these complex adaptive systems that are interwoven, that are nested, that are locked together, that allow us to actually envision the outcomes of the natural convergence of trends and issues so that we could truly get ahead of the future. Sense making. The second is meshing. And this is, as I mentioned a minute ago, what happens when we actually break those silos down. So when we break those silos and we put AI together with the arts and we put doctors together with designers, we don't get doctor designers. And we don't get AI arts. We get something new because the spaces in between are emergent. And actually, a lot of studies and a lot of research is now saying that our big world problems that we're trying to tackle, these SDGs that we're trying to solve, they are exacerbated by the silos that we have. So just gathering more knowledge and gathering more information, gathering more knowledge and information actually exacerbates the problems. It's the breaking of the silos that causes unique solutions and unique properties to emerge. And so that's a big part of it too. And we can teach how to do that. And this is a big part of complex responsive processes. Actually allowing the emergence between me and somebody else in this room, as you did earlier in your exercise, what will emerge out of those kinds of exercises? Something unique, something beautiful, something mysterious, and something wonderful, right? And so this is beyond complex adaptive systems to complex responsive processes. And then when we actually think transformationally and not just incrementally, we're starting to think about those things that are subsisting in the background rather than just those predominant or dominant ideas that are existing in the foreground. There are so many things that exist behind the scenes and those things that we did not put out in the forefront because of our, understanding our imagination that allow us to think beyond incrementalism, that allow us to beyond just making our cell phone, half-inch bigger or half-inch smaller and blue the next time. What is the real higher order purpose of what we're doing? The higher order purpose of an acorn is not 1,000 acorns, friends. It's an oak tree. So if you're in the business of acorns, your goal is not to produce 1,000 acorns. It's to produce an oak tree, and you didn't see that at first when the acorn was there. So you have to understand higher order purpose that's baked into what we do. And that only comes through this complex potential states that we need to think about. How do we actually make this holoptic fly's eye out of what we're doing together? And so we've actually, in our work that we do around the world, she was mentioning that we've worked with all these companies, but our main thing that we really love to do is work, more ethically, and how do we work with resilience officers in cities and people that are saving the rhinos and all this good work that we get to do, right, Yvette? And so we've actually developed what we call natural foresight, which moves away from the predominant foresight models that are in society right now that you might find at the University of Houston or Leeds or Oxford or Harvard or whoever's doing foresight in these different organizations that are teaching it now, to a much more circular, much more collaborative, much more complex, embracing, and just a much more holistic environment. And so you can see some of the tools that we put in here, but we include the push and the pull, and we teach people how to do this through a process that actually embraces and dances with complexity rather than seeing complexity as something to solve. Complexity is not a question to solve. You have to understand that if we're going to move forward collectively. And so I'm just ending on this, and I think we might have time for questions, but it looks like my time is up. Great. Then I just want to leave with you guys that we do actually do this. Oh, I'm really super excited that starting in April, we're going to have a permanent location in New York City. We're doing this in New York City next year, which is our Future Schools, our 3-day program that teaches this kind of thinking and teaches foresight. I actually have some materials up here for you guys. Thank you, Yvette, for pointing that out. I've got a case study that we've done for one of the largest foresight competency building in the world, the Walt Disney Company. I have a foresight primer for you guys. Most of you didn't raise your hand about foresight, I'll teach you foresight in 5 minutes with the primer. And I've actually got a cert kit because we're super proud that this year we launched the first professional foresight certification that's actually based on the across the field, but also is accredited by what we call the Global Foresight Advisory Council, which is made up of the futurists from Ford and from X Prize and from all these big organizations around the world. We're super excited about that. And I think that was my last slide. I just wanted to leave that there for you, not so much as a promotion, obviously it is, but to let you know that we certainly can help you continue to think this way going forward. And we would love for you to join our Democratize the Future movement. So I guess I do have time for questions, but thank you guys so much, yeah. Yes, sir. Oh, yeah. Okay, great.
I could never resist an open microphone.
Yeah.
I want to put in a plug for hindsight for just a second.
Sure.
And the reason is that when things work well, it's sometimes important to know why. When things don't work well, it's also important to know why.
Yeah.
And so, in addition to attempting to anticipate, what about looking back and understanding and analyzing, especially in a complex system where you were unable to do very much prediction? So what do you have to say about that thought?
Oh, I'm so glad you actually brought that up because, of course, hindsight, present insight, foresight, really, I believe, are all part of the same system. And so we can't ignore any of them to really be effective at this. There's no way. Actually, it's really funny that some of the big foresight organizations around the world, some of their best analysts are historians because foresight is the same practice, but in the other direction. And actually, not just in the other direction, but it includes the entire thing. So I think good hindsight, good insight, good foresight really make us a future empowered species, and I'm so glad, Vin, that you brought that up. Yeah. Yes.
I'd love to riff on that theme for a moment. AI is usually built on retrospective data.
That's right.
So it is the way we build models based on hindsight.
Yeah.
And then we can take those models and include them as they're available in the foresight. So
That's
we
right.
get the best of both
That's right.
worlds.
That's
When we
right.
have a historical piece of information
Yeah.
from retrospective data, to the extent that it's not biased and it's valid and it's cleaned,
Yeah.
right? We can combine that with human knowledge of how the systems work and feedback dynamics and all this complexity and holoptic stuff.
That's right.
So to me, I think there's this emerging, we've sort of had this silo between the hindsight, the retrospective analysis, and the forward simulation, and you're unifying that, which is awesome. I just want to.
Yeah, no, I'm really
It's not
glad.
really a question.
It's not. You were just telling me. You're just straight up telling me what it was. Actually, Lauren and I, we've known each other for short, but this is the first time we've actually physically seen each other. And we're super excited to be talking to her more as we sort of join forces and do some stuff together. But I absolutely agree with that 100%. And I love this idea of decision intelligence because I really believe beyond just artificial intelligence, which silos things, decision intelligence is bringing those ideas together. And so it really says at that point where we need to make decisions, the future is not about the future. The future is about today. The way you think about the future directly impacts the actions you're taking today, consciously or subconsciously. So you need to do that more intentionally. If we do that, then we bring it back to the point of decision today, and that's where that comes in. That's where that piece beautifully comes in. So any other questions before? Yes. I think you're on.
Thank you. You've sort of positioned complexity or the questions around complexity as friend or foe. And I wondered what you think of the notion of viewing complexity simply as our reality.
Yeah.
And then you seem to set up a choice between incrementalism and transformation. And I wondered if we really have to choose.
Yeah. Yes.
Or whether we actually need to live in both.
Yeah, I thank you for that so much. So, of course, I had 20 minutes. And it's a great question because we talk about transformational incrementalism. And that's really instead of just being incremental from where we are today, and the decision is right around us within our sphere of influence, and we take that incremental step, intentional evolution or holoptic foresight allows us to say, this is the oak tree. Here's the acorn, there's the oak tree. And once I understand what that emerging future is and where that we're headed, either individually or collectively, then I can come back and say, now I know the incremental steps to take instead of just incrementalism being popularized as something that happens from today to the next step to the next step. So I actually agree with what you're saying. I don't think it's either or, it's a yes and, yeah. And same with complexity, actually. When we think about it a little bit further, the reason I sort of hit over the head today with, it's not a foe, it's a friend, is because I was swinging the pendulum, and because we always think about complexity as being the enemy. We see in every magazine, we've got to stomp complexity, kill complexity, smash it, do something horrible to it. And I want you to think about it quite differently, but I think it is the natural order of things, and that's exactly what I was speaking to. So thank you for that question.
As somebody that kind of works I'm an anthropologist, I told you that earlier. I do speak to a lot of technologists who sort of, this is like really hard work to do, very, very, in terms of just like convincing technologists of how to how to understand complexity.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, I care a lot about algorithmic bias
Yeah.
and sort of the biases that are already inherent in the historicity in open data sources, and what that does to sort of creations for the future. And so I'm wondering, in terms of just like how you, like what the general reception you've had from people who have more linear thinking. And I guess this is also something that we could talk about with Josh, but and ways that like methods that you've been able to overcome that. But sort of, yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah. Ooh, that's a loaded question. There's a lot there. So I'll go through every person I've ever met before. So, there's so much there. And of course, that is exactly what I was showing you, is that the methods of foresight, it's methods, it's tools, but it's a way of thinking more importantly than anything else. Most people who approach foresight talk about it being the field, the methods, the tools, the methodologies. And of course we do that, but ultimately it's a new way of thinking. It's a rewiring of the brain to think a different way. And so there are tools and methods to do that. I won't go into all of them because we don't have time. But yes, and I think across the spectrum, it's surprising you'll meet different people in the same field who think differently. I've met technologists who are wide open to this, and you see technologists who are more closed. I see lawyers come in. I always get afraid when the lawyers show up. As a matter of fact, I've got a new lawyer coming. If there's lawyers in the room, no offense, but the lawyers show up and I'm like, oh my God, I get scared, I sweat a little bit. And then sometimes they turn out to be the best ones because they don't on a normal basis get to think like this creatively. And so they finally have the chance to do that. So it just varies across the field, and I think there's ways to meet people where they are, to meet them right where they are, instead of just, this was obviously a talk in 20 minutes and a wave went over you guys, but normally we meet people right where they are and say, okay, this is how you're dealing with this, and this is what we'll work with, let's work you down the path. And so that's a terrible answer to your question. So, sorry. Yeah, awesome.
Thanks, Frank.
Yep.